name?
My name is Vancie Todaro.
And tell me who your mom and dad were.
My mother was Annie Strada Palisoda, and my dad's name was Giovanni Palisoda.
Okay. First, let's talk about your mom. Who were her parents?
My mom's parents were Joe Strada and Angelina Loria Strada.
Okay. And do you know if either one of them were born in Poggioreale?
They were both born in Poggioreale, and my grandfather Joe came over first, and he left my great grandmother Angelina back in Sicily because she had 5 children. And Grandpa Joe wanted to save up some money so that when he could send for his wife and 5 children, that he would have a place to have them call home.
Do you remember what year that was?
I don't. I looked at the ship, what do you call it?
The records.
Ship records, and I do know that, I don't know what year that was. I'd have to look on the ship records for Grandma Strada. But I do know that when she came over, the youngest baby was 2 months old. Grandpa came in at New York, and I think he made a living doing grocery business, and then he sent for Grandma Angelina. And then she came in on the New Orleans port. And the rest of that is pretty vague. I don't know how Grandpa and Grandma got together, because we didn't learn a lot from our parents about that.
Okay.
But I do know that they got together and they did land in the bottom, and then they moved to town. And Grandma and Grandpa had 10 children altogether. And eventually they bought a house. It was off of I can't think of the road. It was a beautiful house, and it was big. And Grandpa had a fruit garden, and he had a vegetable garden, and he grew cotton. And the children worked in the farm to help Grandpa, and that's how he fed his 10 children. But they were 10 beautiful children, and they grew up, and they had wonderful families. And then the Uncle Charlie was the youngest child, and he thought it was so far out of the city limits that he didn't want to live out in the country anymore. So he persuaded Grandpa and Grandma to move into town. And then they moved off of Victory Street. And that's where I remember my grandmother passing away, and then I remember my grandfather. And one thing about Grandpa Joe, he had this mustache that curled, and every time we went to visit them, which was every Saturday night and every Sunday for lunch, he'd say, "Come bossa me," which meant, "Come kiss me." And the kids didn't want to kiss him because his mustache scratched us. But he was a wonderful man. He was very loving, very caring, and he was very spry until the time that he passed away at age 93. But my grandmother passed away, I think, in 1979. And but we still went over to my grandfather's every Saturday night and every Sunday for lunch, because Grandpa was living with Uncle John and Aunt Lena Strada. And back then, we weren't afraid. They were not afraid for us children to wander off. And on Sunday afternoons, my cousins and I, we would walk from Victory Street to the movie theater, which was the Queen and the Palace, which was on Main Street. And we never had any problems. And then our favorite thing was to go over to Jarrett's after we went to the movies, and we'd have a cherry lime phosphate at Mr. Garrett's. And those were great days. We had a lot of fun. We were very close-knit family. Our families visited, and we were very close-knit. And those were happy times. And we remember those.
And you stayed close to the Strata family all of your life?
All of my life, because my dad's parents were still in Italy, and I never got to meet them. The only memory I have of them is the pictures that only have one picture of Grandpa Mariano and Grandma Vicenza. And then there was a daughter, and her name was, no, wait a minute. I'm describing Grandpa John Palisotis.
Yes, that's fine. Okay.
There were, he left behind his mother, his sister, Felipa. Felipa had a problem. She was deaf, and they would not approve her to come over to the United States for that. And then the other was Felipa and I'm sorry, Antonina was the one that had the problem of being deaf, and Felipa stayed with her parents. And then my dad's oldest brother, Pietro, had come to the United States ahead of them. And my dad was only allowed to go to the 4th grade because Grandpa said, no, you have to work in the fields, and we need your help. So he saved his money, and when he accumulated $47, he went to Palermo, and he boarded a ship, and he came over to the United States to meet with his older brother Pietro, who was living in Dinkins. That was between Bryan and Navasota, and they were farmers. And when my dad came over here and they had established themselves, they sent over for the younger brother Salvatore, which was Uncle Sam Palisoto. And then the flood came in 1913, and it washed their house all the way down the Brazos River, and they ended up salvaging the house, and they lived in probably Mumford at that time. And then when Uncle Sam came over, they decided that they were going to go into the carpentry business. Neither one of them had knowledge of being carpenters. They knew nothing. My dad spoke some English. In fact, Dad was known as a poet in Poggioreale, and he wrote some very beautiful poems, especially the poem that we recite at the St. Joseph altars. And that was patented, and it was copyrighted while he was in Italy. And if you go to Italy today, and the trips that we took to Italy, we were able to see his original poem. We had located it at the end of our 3rd trip. Mr. Maniscalco had the poem. And in later years, when my children were grown and showed an interest in going back to Poggioreale, we went and we visited, and then we located one of our cousins that was born from, it was Felipa. And she married an Ancona. And it was an experience, because when we got there, she didn't really know who we were, and she didn't invite us in real openly. But we had an interpreter. Our driver was Roberto, and so he translated what we were trying to say, because we didn't speak Italian. And so when she found out who we were, she welcomed us in their home with open arms. And oh my gosh, there was not enough that they could do for us. So it was a wonderful trip and very enjoyable. My dad was a workaholic, and he would get up early in the morning go to work, and he'd come back home about sundown. And he couldn't do that anymore. He was such a loving dad. He was so kind. He always remembered our birthdays. And if my mother or myself or my sister had a birthday, you could bet your life he was going to go by Miss Condon's and buy a birthday cake and bring it home to us. And my mother was a fantastic cook. She could cook anything without a recipe. She measured increments in her hands. And so we tried to learn her recipes. We'd say, okay, Grandma, go ahead and measure it in your hand. And then we would put it into a teaspoon or a cup or whatever to measure out what we thought was going to be her recipe. But to this day, I can't make the sauce like my mother did. And the best homemade bread. And I remember on Friday nights, because we didn't eat meat on Friday, Grandma Ann would always cook fried fish, homemade bread, and then she called all the grandkids, and she said, y'all better be here. And sure enough, they would all come, even though they had a date or something. They would come and eat, and then they would leave. But I love my parents dearly. I miss them so much, but I have such beautiful memories. As Italians, we always believed in faith, food, and family. And so we always kept close to one another. And every chance that we got, we were together, especially on Sundays when we had meatballs and spaghetti. And I can remember my Aunt Lena, who was married to Uncle John. She always made this coconut cake with pineapple filling, and it was always so warm when we got ready to eat it. And we looked forward to that every Sunday. But I had beautiful parents. I wouldn't ask God to give me any other parents than those people that I had. Grandpa John and Grandpa and Grandma Angelina. And I'm sorry, Grandpa John and Grandma Ann were my parents. And I was an only child for 9 years. And I kept wanting a sister to play with because it was kind of lonely, although my aunts and uncles would come by and pick me up and take them with them. And it was fun, but it was lonely. And so I'd always ask Mother, I said, Mama, can I have a baby sister? And she says, well, when it rains, we'll go outside and we'll make a baby sister out of mud. Well, 9 years later, my mother became pregnant, and she had my sister, Angelina. So there's 9 years difference between us. But we've always been close.
How did you and your husband meet?
Well, that's a funny story. Actually, I did not realize that my husband and I met at Uncle John Rufino's store because I was attending Bowie School. And I didn't have a way to get home. So when Daddy got off work, I would walk from school to Uncle John's grocery store. And I'd wait for him there. And he had a swing. And Ross happened to be there one day visiting his aunt and uncle. And he just pushed the swing and knocked me off. That was our first encounter, okay? So then years lapsed. And then we met again at the CYO at St. Anthony's Church. And he was such a strict person about Robert's rules because he had learned this at high school. And he thought our meetings had to be run strictly by Robert's rules. And when he came to the meeting, we just could not stand him. We'd say, okay, Ross, it's okay. We're going to do it this way. And he would get mad. But we went on trips back then because of CYO. We would go to Hearn, we would go to Rockdale, we would go to Plantersville, we'd go to Brenham, because at that time we would have volleyball teams or baseball teams, and we'd go there, and we'd play games, and then we'd come back. And then we started going to the conventions. And the CYO conventions were so great. I mean, we loved it. We went there, and somehow Ross and I kind of got to going together. And I guess about after 5 years of going together, we decided we'd get married. And so that's the story about Ross and my life. My dad had bought some property, which is actually not far from downtown Bryan. And at that time, there was an Air Force base here in Bryan. And so he bought the property to rent out, and he built a duplex behind this 2-story house. So when Ross and I got married, we lived in the 2-story house with our children, and I loved the house. It was beautiful, and I wanted so much to restore it. But my Uncle Charlie, who was a carpenter, said, "Vancie, you don't want to redo this house because you've got single walls, and your plugs are going to be on the outside of the walls, and you're not going to like that." So when Ross Jr. was born, he had asthma, and that was due to the silt coming in the walls. And then I had another child, Michael, whom God took from us 3 days before his first birthday. But God, in his humor, I became pregnant, and Grace Anna was born 2 weeks after Michael passed away. And 2 years later, we had another son named David. And we were going to a doctor in Navasota, Dr. Conklin, and he was such a wonderful doctor. In fact, when Grace Anna or Ross Jr. got sick, it made more sense for us to drive to Navasota and get him to the doctor because we didn't have to wait as long. Dr. Conklin would always meet us there. And he would love the children. He'd hug them and kiss them, and he was just a fantastic doctor. So when David got sick and started having asthma problems, my husband got very upset. And he says, "We're tearing this house down." And the day that I got back, my husband Ross went upstairs and he started tearing the house down. Luckily, there was a garage apartment that was behind our old house. So the garage apartment was probably the entire upstairs was probably the size of maybe my living room, maybe a little bit bigger. We had 3 children, and it was funny because we would go up there, and but when I fixed dinner or lunch, we had to come downstairs and have a table where we ate outside. And at night, we would go back up to the apartment, and we'd take down the table, and we'd set up the beds for the kids to sleep there. It was only 1 bedroom, a bath, and a living room, and a small kitchen. But we made it. We have wonderful memories of that. And while we were living there, Ross and my dad, John Palisota, started building the new house. And so together they built the house that we live in and I'm still living in today. And then the bypass took my mother's house, my mother and dad's house, and so they bought some property about 2 blocks down from us, from the Lampos, Sally and Mike. And as soon as my house was built, then they started on their house.
So, your whole life you heard about Poggioreale. What does it mean to grow up knowing that you were from Poggioreale?
Well, you know, my parents didn't really talk about it because my dad always said, "I don't want to go back to Poggioreale." We begged him to go back. He says, "No, it was too hard to leave my family." And I think I got really interested in Poggioreale after my parents had passed away, after my dad had passed away. And I got interested in trying to find out if we still have relatives there. Our first trip to Poggioreale, to Venice, was to see our cousin Megan graduate from chef school there that she attended. And at that point, we didn't really see a lot of Poggioreale. So we came back home and I got interested and I thought, yeah, we need to go back because I'd really like to see if we have relatives still there. And we did. My son Ross and his wife Geneva and my sister and I and my daughter Grace Anna, we all went back to Poggioreale and we made some discoveries there. And we met a lot of our cousins, which was very interesting, and we learned a lot. I wished I had been able to talk to my dad more in depth about his life there. The only thing I remember is they had an earthquake which destroyed the old town. And the first time I put my feet on the grounds of the old town, it was a feeling I couldn't describe because I was standing there and I could see where my daddy had walked, and that meant a lot to me. And then we went back a second time, and I had a St. Joseph altar in 1912, I think it was. And I had a cousin, Cersei, and she was teaching anthropology at the University of Texas. And she got interested in our ancestors. But at that altar, she and her husband came down with her daughter, and they photographed the altar that was held in 1912. I believe that.
No, 1912 was when Grandpa just came over. 19 maybe.
I meant 2012.
There you
I'm
go.
sorry.
Okay.
And so it hit the internet, and several people have seen it. In fact, I think it's still on Poggioreale in America. It's called Texas Tavola, if you want to go back and look at it. And it was a beautiful film.
Papa John believed very strongly in the St. Joseph altar. He was
Yes, my dad was very strong in the St. Joseph altars. He was also very strong in his faith to St. Anthony. And back when I was growing up, the St. Joseph altars were very prominent. I mean, there'd be like 8 or 10 altars at a time. And my dad always was invited to say the rosary in Italian to St. Joseph. And there would be times that my dad would say 3 or 4 rosary a night. And as young kids, we just, we couldn't understand why we had to go and participate with this. But it was a tradition of his that made us so much stronger. And today I still have great admiration for St. Joseph as well as St. Anthony, because there's so many stories that I know about both saints. I think the very first altar that I ever ate at was my godmother's, Mary Gullo. And back then her mother was still alive. And she would dress us according to the saint that we represented. And I remember I was Mary, and I had a blue cape, and I think that's one of the altars that I never will forget about, because it was ingrained, and my dad would get so upset because she would say 3 rosaries. She'd say 1 to Jesus, 1 to Mary, and 1 to St. Joseph. But we didn't get to stay long after he said that because we had to go to other altars to visit. But my mom was such a sweetheart, she just went right along with us,
So tell us about growing up in St. Anthony's Parish. What do you remember?
Oh, St. Anthony's Parish. I grew up I guess St. Anthony's Parish was built, the new church, because the first church of St. Anthony's was located near the St. Joseph Catholic Church today, and it burned. And so the people from St. Anthony's really didn't have any place to go. They had to reestablish their church. And so the church was rebuilt on the corner of 29th and Parker. And Father Bravi was the pastor that I remember the most. He was from Italy. He was brought over, I guess you would consider him a missionary priest. And so back then there was a divided, what would you say?
Two factions of the church.
There was a church for the Polish, which was St. Joseph. There was a church for St. Anthony's, which was Italian. There was a church, St. Teresa's, which was Hispanic. And there was also a black church. The black church is no longer in existence. But St. Anthony's and St. Joseph and St. Teresa still are here today. There came a time, because back then there was sort of a division between the Corleonese and the Poggioreale. The people from Corleone, their patron saint was Saint Leo Luke. The people from Poggioreale, their saint was Saint Anthony. So when it came to naming the church, they drew straws. And they put 3 straws together. And the one that got the most votes, that would be the name of the church. And the one that lost would have the biggest statue. So if you visit St. Anthony's today, if you look on your left, that's St. Anthony's. And on the right is St. Leo Luke. But he has the biggest statue. But I have very fond memories of Father Bravi. He was quite an elegant speaker. He was invited to New York every year to speak to the people there. And even at St. Anthony's, because back then he spoke in Italian and we didn't understand what was going on. We were just at Mass. But he would have people at St. Anthony's in tears. Some of the traditions at St. Anthony's we try to hold to today, like the St. Joseph altar, the Feast of St. Anthony, and the Feast of St. Leo Luke. In the past couple of years, some of that has died. But those of us that had parents that came from Poggioreale, we still hold on to those traditions. We still hold on to the St. Joseph altars, the Feast of St. Anthony, and St. Leo Luke. But, the rift between the Corleonese and the Poggioreale have died, There's difference in dialects. They say some of the words different from what we say in the Poggioreale dialect. But there have been some wonderful... Well, actually, Father Bravi designed St. Anthony's Church after the St. Anthony Church in Poggioreale. And he brought over... he had an altar made in Poggioreale. And they shipped it here. St. Anthony's has sort of a cove behind the main altar. And when they brought the altar here, it was made out of mahogany. It was beautiful wood. But it didn't fit in the cove. So they had to cut the cross off the top to get it to fit. So if you're looking at it today, you'll notice that there's some, you can tell where the cross was taken off. And then Father Bravi brought over an organ, a pipe organ. And it was all well, it was a beautiful organ, but he didn't find anybody that could play it. I think Miss Newland tried, and I can't remember if they really accomplished it or not, but then they later destroyed the pipe organ because they couldn't get anybody to learn how to play it. And so they just bought a simple organ back to St. Anthony's. But I remember the feast of St. Anthony. My dad was the treasurer, and when St. Anthony's Day came along, we would go to church early in the morning, and we would stay through the masses. But my dad would buy statues of St. Anthony in different sizes, and according to what the donation was, you got that size statue. And then he had medals, and he had prayer cards and everything. And after that was all over, Father Brabi would invite the trustees, is what they were called. He would invite them for barbecue in the rectory. And sometimes, I can't remember the day that he went back to Italy, and he brought over Father Peter Villani. And Father Peter was a short little person, and we always kidded because he couldn't find these shoes to fit him. And he always bought shoes bigger than his size, and when he'd walk down the aisle, you could hear his shoes squeaking. So, but he was a very gentle man. There's a lot of stories about Father Bravi I could tell. But whatever Father Bravi wanted, whatever the church needed, the trustees would come together, the farmers would donate bales of cotton or whatever they had. And they would sell that and then use the money to complete the church.
Do you think being Poggioreale based, or you being a Portuguese person, has affected your life?
It has.
Mm-hmm.
Because I hold all the traditions that my dad brought over from Poggioreale, the fact that my dad lived in Poggioreale, that my grandfather was from Poggioreale, and my grandmother, and it has a special place in my heart. And I love St. Anthony's Church, and all the memories that I hold dear to my heart, that were done then. And I love being Italian, and I love being from Poggioreale.